going to talk about energy and things around data centers and what they do. And in a way, my talk, I realized, just picks up on where Anne left things on Monday, because Anne spoke very much about different kind of decarbonization gestures and practices that we could do at a micro level, personal level, scholars, to intervene or act upon carbon emissions of the digital industries. And I want to take this on the other side. So we all know about the critique of data centers since now more than 10 years back that, well, they're big consumers of energy, and usually this argument about big consumption of energy has been also connected to, well, they're following this big emitters of carbon emissions, because it's assumed that, well, the grids they're powered with are powered by fossil fuel energy. But what I was troubled with increasingly the last year or two was that, well, we don't actually have much discussion on issues that emerge around the volume of energy consumption of data centers. What else can we say besides carbon? But also, how can we think about developments of the data center industry when they're going green or renewable? So, and particularly this troubled me because of the context in which I'm living, so Sweden, where we have all the big tech actors coming and establishing data centers, because Sweden has one of the the electricity grid is to a large extent almost entirely driven by renewable energy sources. So nuclear, hydropower, and more recently wind power. So this has appeared to be a very lucrative market for data centers to both establish data centers as such that take grid green energy from the grid, but also to become actors in the renewable energy production market by sponsoring wind farms. And I'm now going to share my slides and talk more about these things. So one of the issues that we've seen emerging in Sweden, and I'm just going to mention it briefly, but not going to talk extensively today about, is what we are terming with colleagues energy gentrification. And this is grid capacity issues. So basically, yes, data centers consume a lot of energy, a lot of electricity, and when they're established in places where we have a lot of electrifying industries and a lot of developments where, for instance, on consumer level, people are buying electric cars or installing solar panels, and basically we have a transforming geography of energy production and energy distribution. We've noticed that in some places, this establishment of data centers can cause shortages of grid capacity. And we have this landmark case from 2019 in the southern province of Malmö, the city of Malmö, in the southern province of Skåne, in Sweden, where Microsoft established a data center sometime around 2019, and they claimed about 10 megawatts of capacity from the grid. And at the same time, a local bakery tried to also apply for a permit, and they were denied because there was not enough electricity, not enough capacity left in the grid. So that's caused a lot of controversies locally, and the whole discussion became about, well, who has the right to grid capacity if the big tech industries are taking it, and like basically who benefits from these establishments and so on. And what I think is exciting about this development, or interesting, is that we don't see them only in south of Sweden, but also in places, to my knowledge, like Dublin, Paris, Amsterdam, and other regions in Sweden, for instance, where Amazon has established 3 large data centers, and there currently other industries that are electrifying cannot establish. So it creates a lot of tension. So this is one path of developments that I think we're going to look at more, but I'm not going to talk so much about. But then the other one is related to, on the other side, what I said, the data center industry has been, well, greening itself. And this has happened in many different ways, including bringing, like, for instance, creating different kind of carbon metrics, or most, I would say, influentially, after this critique that came by Greenpeace through their 2 reports about how dirty is your cloud and clicking green, Google and Amazon, and subsequently other players, have launched these mega projects to offset, account their carbon emissions by contracting agreements with wind power, new wind power plants in various places, and saying that, well, in this way we contribute to offsetting our carbon emissions. And here the Nordics are particularly exciting and interesting because here's a map that I will show you a lot of maps today. But this is a map from Google's website. I don't know from which year because it didn't specify which year it is. But this is taken from the Google's website where they explain their sustainability program about carbon-free energy. And this map shows different dots. The blue ones are the power purchase agreements where they've contracted sort of like green energy, renewable energy from wind, and the yellow ones are from solar. And you can see that in this map, the Nordics are central for these developments. And according to, just need to go one slide back, but according to a Norwegian newspaper, I don't know how trustworthy this data is, but they say that in the coming 10 years, the companies like Google, Facebook, Amazon, as well as 2 large aluminum smelters operating in the Nordics, are going to claim or need about 20 terawatts of all the wind power production in the Nordics. And what I want to do today, saying that I want to bring some empirics here, that's the materials that I'm still thinking through, is I want to zoom into one of these dots on the grid, this red one here, which is one particular wind park in Sweden, in a county called Jämtland. It's in the geographical center of Sweden. But in a popular discourse, it would be considered somewhere in the north. It's called the Birchwater Björkvatnet. And I wanted to talk about this wind park as a way to zoom in a bit on the politics on the ground of making these arrangements, and what does making a power purchase agreement do locally? What kind of how does it basically how is this process entangled with various kind of local frictions, colonial politics, and knowledge politics, and also resource politics, managing wind as a resource. And I'm here inspired by Donna Haraway, and one of the very first sentences in her book, where she says that, well, the task is to make kin in lines of inventive connection as a practice of learning to live and die well with each other in a thick present. So I want to thicken this present about, well, what does it mean to establish power purchase agreements by zooming on one such site, and hopefully see where does this bring us and what other kind of presents and futures we can build. And the reason why this wind park held my attention a few years ago was that in the media, there appeared this news with the CEO of Google visiting Finland, visiting Sweden, where they just said, Google is building this wind power, Google is building wind power park into Swedish municipalities. You see them here, Ragunda and Örnsköldsvik. And what it it made a deal in 2019 with these two places in Sweden, and also at a place in Finland and a place in Norway. And this was framed in the media as a package deal. They wanted to, as if they just wanted to, get green power. They really wanted to green their operations. And then they just came and made these package deals, and all of a sudden, everything is done. And this struck me as really interesting because in Sweden, wind power, and like in other places, has been a really contested issue. So what I wanted to see is, well, what did it mean to actually do this on the ground? And could they really just so easily establish this wind park? Because, for instance, today, almost 80%, or if not almost all, applications for wind power establishments in Sweden get rejected because there is a very strong movement against wind power. But Google and similarly Amazon also had some establishments of this kind. They never got this, it seemed, from the media. So in my remaining time, I want to tell you 4 stories with maps about the establishment of this particular wind park. And the way I'm thinking with maps is in 2 ways. I see maps, one part as a political device. They enact reality, but also produce actionability. So, for instance, also historically, maps have been related, of course, to colonial politics. And today, as you will see, they partly are entangled with these, but also with other kind of action that extend colonial legacies, but also unsettled disputes from the past of Sweden. And I also use the map here as a way to tell the story, as a knowledge device that can be mobilized to illuminate or make knowable the entanglements, frictions, and mundane violence that a dot on a Google's map, the wind power where this PPA agreement is made, is creating between different human and more than human worlds. And in the end, maybe, after seeing and talking about these different stories and different maps, maybe we can start thinking about how to produce alternative maps and mappings that can mobilize an alternative politics. I'm not sure how to do this, but I'll leave it as an open question. And here on the photo is this one of the wind turbines, part of this park. And just to give you a little bit of context, so I visited this site in January. It was most often in this fog that you see on the picture. I chose this picture because it also gives you a little bit of sense of the scale. So these turbines are all about 220 meters tall, and there are about 33 of them, but they're part of a larger cluster of 250 turbines in the same area. And in some way, these are the largest, the highest entities in the northern landscape in Sweden currently. There is no high rises. It's mostly an area covered by forests. So these are standing as really giant constructions in the middle of the forest. Yes, and what I wanted to tell before I move into the maps is that so the project about, so the media presented things as if Google just came, gave the money, and they got the agreement, and then the wind park was built. The project, in fact, was latent for about 10 years because it couldn't find any capital. But the capital of Google actually brought it to fruition. So even if Google doesn't own the park, it was built because of the Google money. And now the park stands there. So I'm going to move to my 4 stories. And I just want to say that, I mean, since this is very much raw, material in progress, These stories are patchy. Maybe they're not fitting together well as a coherent argument, but they're, four different kind of perspectives to think with that collide, all of them, in this dot on the Google map. And I will show you later a bit more of it. Yeah, so why Google was able to make this contract to start with. It is because of a new geography of wind production in Sweden. So Sweden is a country covered to a large extent by forest. And most of these forests are commercial and used for intense timber production and have been used in this way for a long time. And most of the forests are owned by a majority owner called Swedish Cellulose Limited, a very non-poetic name, abbreviated SCA. And importantly, until 2007, all northern Sweden, so what you see in this middle map in the blue, all northern Sweden was considered inappropriate for wind farm establishments because, well, it does not blow enough in the forests. It also does not blow very much when it is cold, and it is cold in -degrees in the winter for most of the time in these latitudes. So the wind as such was not considered to be profitable in order to establish any kind of larger commercial wind parks. But around 2004, the Swedish Energy Agency commissioned a University of Uppsala team from the Institution for Geosciences to develop a new model which would map wind speeds in heights. So they thought, well, maybe wind was still exploitable. Maybe we could still build wind installations in case we just started to think about the heights beyond the forest level, so to say. So a team of scholars in this Institute for Geosciences in Uppsala University produced a computer model of the atmosphere at three heights, at 49, 72, and 103 meters above the vegetation line, wherever this vegetation was. So there were a lot of flaws of this model. They said it's approximations. It is very much inaccurate because it doesn't take into account terrain differences at a very granular level. Obviously, plants have different heights and so on. So they just normalized all this and created a big map. So what you see here in the middle is a 49 meters map and a 103 meters map. And what you see, the way you can interpret this map is that the map in the middle, the blue, so the more orange and green, orange and yellow colors are, the more it blows. So all these blue areas are still not enough wind, or at least in order for wind power in Sweden to be considered commercially exploitable, it should blow at speeds more than 7, 6.5, 7, better 8 meters a second, which are those that are towards the red color. And you see, most of this is still not. But then on the right-hand side, if you go to heights at 100 meters, the picture, well, changes slightly, but still not so much. Nevertheless, this model became, since 2009, the base model for which the Swedish government and the Swedish Energy Agency decided that, well, wind power could be established in Sweden, actually in all the country, including the north, if we build high enough wind turbines. So at heights at 200 meters, even 250 meters, even higher, it could be profitable. And Google's wind park, which you see here circled with a red circle and the dot, became the first test site in the world to test new turbines of General Electric, which were at these heights. And these tests were, to a large extent, also partly failed because they had suffered a lot of problems with falling blades that, didn't cause injuries, but it happened several times. So the park has not been working full capacity. The model has also some shortcomings because it doesn't consider that wings are being covered by ice, and also it doesn't blow when it's too cold. But this engineers from General Electric didn't know when they were designing the turbines, and nobody even the scholars in this Institute for Geosciences didn't consider that when this model doesn't consider the cold aspect, temperature. But nevertheless, it is today used for establishing these large-scale parks. And basically, it redrew the whole geography of energy production in Sweden. Now, what did this map do? When this was established, all municipalities in Sweden were asked to develop local plans for areas, which areas could be established for, could be zoned for wind power. And here I get to my story number 2 with other maps. So the state interest to establish wind power collides with the state interest to maintain indigenous population reindeer herding. So you see here reindeers and wind parks in the north of Sweden. And this other map that you see on this slide is one that shows indigenous Sami population herding lands. And this is a very long story that I don't have the time to I'll really go into here. But this map is a result of what scholars of political science refer to internal colonialism in Sweden. So basically, internal colonization refers to the unresolved processes through which Western society and indigenous peoples have come to inhabit the same territories, and the continuing indigenous resistance to colonial occupation of those indigenous territories. And unlike in external colonialism, here I'm drawing on work by Rebecca Lawrence, who is building on colonial studies scholars. So unlike external colonialism, she writes, in which the colonies and imperial society exist on different territories, internal colonization refers to the process whereby the colonizing society is built on the territories of the formerly free and now colonized peoples. And this creates an unresolved contradiction that the settler society attempts to exercise exclusive jurisdiction over the same territories that the indigenous peoples refuse to surrender. And here on this map, this is a map that is produced by the Swedish Sami Parliament, the indigenous, the council, the Parliament of the indigenous people, the indigenous Sami people, whose livelihood is based on reindeer herding. And this is a map which designates their territories where they have the right to exercise reindeer herding. And as you see, these are the same as the new territories of the wind cartography, basically. And Google's wind park falls also into them. So in practice, not only Google's subsidized wind park, but all the wind parks that have been built since then have become a contested objects, because and the subject of very many appeals and lawsuits by the Sami people, because they encroach their winter herding territories. So usually the Samis in Sweden live in the left part of this left map on the left-hand side during the summer parts of the year, and then they move their reindeers towards the south. And you see here, for instance, in the middle map, where you have the red dot, this is the wind park by Google, is on this Jinjevari Sami village, winter herding territory. And what happens is that at each case, the state, the local municipality, has to negotiate who to give priority, the reindeer herding or the wind power interest. However, so far, big capital, often brought by big tech or other kind of financialization developments with around big wind parks, have pushed, as a rule, the Sami people to lose these appeals, to lose court cases, and have parts of these territories cut. And here there's a lot of suffering, basically, and a lot of emotion and anger about these developments, because each wind park removes part of the food that the reindeers eat in the winter, which is ecologies of moss, special moss, that take about 100 years to grow. So it is not possible to replace. And then they suffer also from the construction of roads, which cut transportation pathways, but also make reindeers easier prey for other animals that inhabit these forests, such as wolves or others. I don't know the names in English, sorry. So it becomes a very contested area that partly Sami territories are removed, and partly in this mundane way through paperwork around making the digital industry greener and other industry greener, but also the reindeers become even more threatened by not only climate change, but lack of food. And then there come all sort of new strategies to mitigate this issue by, for instance, compensation by providing artificial food for the reindeers. But then it comes to questions of obligation and who provides these compensations and does it, and so on. It's a very tense and unresolved issue. But basically, it extends the unresolved and unsettled disputes between the indigenous population and the Swedish state that was unsettled since the 1800s, and wind park establishments like these are just continuing them. Now, I want to start wrapping up, and I still have 2 maps to go through. So I'll just very briefly mention them. So map 3 is this one, and this is a map that reflects. So it's not only indigenous people that live there, but also local Swedes who are not part of urban areas, but just people who live in the so-called northern countryside. And this is another form of, I could say, internal colonialism that has been happening in Sweden, where resources from the north have been extracted for the use in the south, like for areas primarily like Stockholm, Gothenburg, and Malmö. And here on this map, you see a river, a very big river, where you see I don't know if it's possible to see it very well, but these black strikes there show the construction of hydropower since the 1930s, which were constructed by Stockholm companies to transport electricity from the north to the south. And this process has left a very big imprint in the locals as well, because it had created a lot of, partly it changed the landscape of the area entirely, but also it left many people bitter because of causing unemployment and not bringing much to people, just extracting the resources. Locals say, well, we don't need this. We don't need this hydropower. It's not. We're not that many here, but it's all extracted for the south. And so you see here again, the red dot is where the Google Park is. So it's also in the shade of these legacies, and it taps into these developments. And the locals who live there are also saying, well, we're also a native population. And they tell all sort of affected stories about how they're excluded from decision-making process. And here I have 2 quotes from some of them who are interviewed in January. So one is saying, for instance, the group deciding the area of the wind park were guys with cardigans. I have no clue who they were. They just came and pointed this hill, that hill. And then another one said how, well, we don't have a bathhouse, we don't have a sports hall, we have the forest, and that's our playground, and we don't need growth. We're fine with what we have. So these legacies and what the water power left people with are informing today also the attitudes and relation to the new wind parks established in the area, one of which is the Google Wind Park. And they start drawing maps, these 4 kinds of map of also, well, the tensions there, like who is affected and who is not, whose voice matters, when. So, for instance, this is a map which says one of my interviewees drew when they were discussing compensation for loss of forest, for more sound and disturbance, basically, caused to the area. And this is completely aside of the question of the reindeers. So for the locals who actually live there, even though this is a territory or a place which is considered as nobody lives there, but people do live there, and also animals and others. This is an area that a map that they draw that, well, who is affected? And companies who come and build, like Google, and also their subcontractors, have one understanding. For instance, everyone who is 800 meters apart is considered affected, but maybe there's nobody at 800 meters, but there is somebody at 2 kilometers, and then they're considered, well, you don't have a voice in this. So there's a lot of play with numbers, of meters of proximity to different towers of the wind park that construct this idea of the who is unaffected public. It's often a human public, not the reindeers or eagles or others, but also these affected publics become affective publics. They have a lot of feelings, lack of trust, sense of a lack of legitimacy in the process, and to a large extent, a sense of powerlessness. And it's kind of paradoxical because they are part of the majority population that is nevertheless a minority in the country, just because of choosing a lifestyle historically or for historical reasons or for other reasons to live far from the metropolitans. And here is some quotes that came also in interviews. So those who wanted to build came, people in suits in a truck. Oh, it will be a great development, they said. He stands and speaks, and people just listen and say, ah, and oh. And then comes the consultation arranged by the same people in suits. And the consultation is this process where locals are supposed to be able to say whether they agree or not this park to be constructed. But then they say the consultation is for those who live 2.5 kilometers away. But there are not enough people in such a radius. So I came from further away, from 5 kilometers away. And then they say, well, why are you here? You don't live here. And so there's all this politics of contestation of who matters and where. And these other maps are drawn there as well. And this is another map of the wind park, of the Google's wind park, where locals in relation to that said that the consultation about a Google's wind park was announced in another municipality, not in the one in which it was built. And only one family appealed and the project went forward. And they said, well, if we're negative, we don't get invitations to participate in the consultations. It is us against them, shameful. One lives in a state of threat. The corporations have money, lawyers. In the eyes of the state, we become amateurs. There is no protection net at all. So this is my last slide here. And I think with these different maps, it's a very condensed story, but I hope that you get a sense of how I think that there is a lot of potential to zoom into this new geographies of big tech, so-called green power or renewable generated power, and create other accounts of, well, thicken the present and perhaps develop narratives of how we can live and die, or who lives and dies. Is it the moss, or is it the humans, or is it the data that lives around these new developments? And also how different kind of expertise and politics of knowledge, whose knowledge matters, whose voice matters, are shaping these new relations. And I was reading recently also Simone Hove's Ecologics book on wind power, which I think that one very great point that she makes there is that wind parks, not only in Sweden, but in many places of the world, are built with an ethos of exploitation rather than rehabilitation, even if a new energy form could have enabled the possibility to approach things a bit differently. So I was left thinking, can these big tech wind parks be redone with an ethos of rehabilitation? What would it mean? And if they can, maybe they cannot exist at all. So yeah, I will end up in this.